All right, welcome to everyone. This is, of course, the Roundtable on Volume 6 of Zapruder World. My name is Brian J. Griffith. I'm the current managing editor for the journal, and I'm going to give some introductory remarks to this particular meeting in terms of how the format will be laid out, what we'll be doing, along with some introductory words just about the journal in general for anyone who is not already familiar with our work. And then we'll get started with today's Roundtable. So this roundtable is on volume 6 of Zapruder World, which of course is on the subject of cinema and social conflicts, published late last year. The journal, for those of you who are not acquainted with Zapruder World, is an open access history journal, roughly themed around the history of social conflicts and international perspective. We have now officially 6 volumes available for open access on our website, zapruderworld.org, ranging in topics from the international history of LGBTQI movements and organizations, to cinema, to food and world history and social conflicts. So we have a wide range of topics to select from, and again, everything is open access, so it's free to read and to share. I should say a few words about our parent organization, which is Storia in Movimento, which translates to Histories in Movement. It's an Italian organization that runs another journal called Zapruder, which is an Italian language journal. And Zapruder World is the English language digital kind of companion journal to Zapruder. And so Storia in Movimento runs both of these journals. And if you're interested in learning more about the organization, you can go to storiainmovimento.org or go to zapruderworld.org, and you can find a link to Storia in Movimento there. All right, so with those comments out of the way, I think I'll get us started with today's roundtable. We will be starting with some open introductory remarks from 2 of the co-editors from Volume 6, and then we'll be moving on to short presentations from a number of the volume's authors, which will be followed by a Q&A session. So if you are joining us here in Zoom, you can use the chat dialogue to enter your question, or if you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can enter a comment or a question into the comment section of the Facebook Live dialogue, and I'll be monitoring both locations for your questions, and we'll be fielding them during that section of today's meeting. All right, so without further ado, I'll hand things over to Luca Peretti.
Hello, everyone. My name is Luca. I'm currently based at Warwick University in the UK. When we started working on this issue, I think it was 2 or 3 institutions ago, because it was so long time ago that many things had happened in our lives and in the world. As many other projects, this issue has been affected by the global pandemic crisis and how it stretched the time of the things we have done in the past year or so. Nonetheless, we are extremely happy to finally see this published. And I think we started working on this on summer 2018 or something like that, first with Brian Griffith and Claudio Fogo, and then I asked Daniel Fairfax and Keiji Kunigami to co-edit this issue with me. We are very happy about the shape it took. We received a high number of proposals at the beginning, and it was kind of hard actually to get down to this select group of papers. And you'll hear something about those papers today, and we'll just say a couple of words about the papers which were written by the authors that cannot be here with us today, unfortunately. So in this issue of Zapruder World, we examined the articulation between cinema and social conflict in both the historical and contemporary context, and also in the theoretical and methodological forms. The next issue of Zapruder World, and if you're interested, I really invite you to go on our website and see the call for paper there, will be on music. So we are on a sort of journey to look at different forms of art and how they interact with conflicts. The issue after, that is 2023 at the point, no, 2022, sorry, that will be on the anti-G8 protest in Genoa in 2001 and the kind of global impact of that. So if you're working on that too, I suggest that you keep an eye on our call for paper. So we're going to say a couple of things about our introduction, and then we'll go to the authors. So I'll now pass the word to Keiji.
Hey, hello everybody. So I'm Keiji Kunigami. I'm assistant professor film and media studies, Irvine, UC Irvine. So just to open our little our conversation here with our introduction to the journal, I just wanted to point, I mean, the introduction that Danny, Luca, and I wrote, it's basically we do an overview of the relations or possible relations between film and social struggle, political struggle. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we write about early cinema and third cinema. Luca, I speak, you speak, and I speak back, right? Okay. So we're going to do a little bit of a chronological order of the text. So as you know, I mean, the history of the relation between social conflict and cinema goes back to the beginnings of cinema. But one thing that I wanted to point out that we emphasize in our introduction is that actually cinema starts, the beginnings of cinema, the early cinema, and then also entering silent cinema era, points at the importance of understanding the place of invisibility, right? The place of invisibility to understanding the relation between social struggles or, systems of oppression and the medium of cinema, right? Especially because film appears as an apparatus of the modern world system, and which is, of course, centered around the colonial powers. And so you have in the early years of cinema a lot of different ways in which cinema can actually conceal, or repress power structures. So I think the first relations of, because, although when we think about social struggle, social conflict and cinema, we usually tend to think about political cinema, militant cinema, cinema that resists. It's important to understand that this relation starts kind of in the opposite direction, right? And so it also points out the importance of understanding the ways that invisibility is central to cinema, especially when we think about ethnographic film, travelogues, in the early years of cinema. And there is this very funny example that we mentioned in the text of the Nordisk film, The Lion Hunter, where they staged Africa in the Scandinavia. So you have all these weird different ways that cinema could actually, spur colonial imaginaries and kind of participate in the structures of oppression of the modern world system, especially cinema being one modern apparatus of control also, right? So this is what we said about early cinema. Luca can continue.
Yeah, we then identify, of course, a few important moments. One is the emergence of Soviet cinema, of course, the first, possibly the first movement that really represents revolutionary practices, creating a new cinematographic languages. The names of course, Sergei Eisenstein, Budvokin, Ziga Vertov will be familiar to many of you, and they recounted the revolution in the first years of the Soviet Union. This is very important for the discourse that we had in our journal, because it's a moment where theory and practice, language and discourse, they go hand in hand. In fact, those directors accompanying their films with important theoretical texts that were translated more or less as they came out widely, and they found home even in places as different as fascist Italy. Outside of the USSR, from 1929 to 1934, we looked, for example, at Japan and the Proletarian Film League, Prokino, the youth cinema for the political organization of Japanese workers and to confront the imperialist state. Maybe a movement that was less known, but not less important if we really want to look at the global history of cinema. 1944 is another sort of symbolic moment when Roberto Rossellini and his collaborators started working on Rome Open City in Italy. Italian neorealism, in fact, would have and somehow still has a fundamental importance for the cinema of revolutionary movements. To sort of bridge to the next part, to the next section, it's not a coincidence that Sadi Jassef, a member of the Algerian Front, the Algerian Liberation Front, he came to Italy to look for a director for the Battle of Algiers. He wanted as a way to sort of build a new realism for his country as well. And I'm gonna pass the word to Keiji again.
We continue on our introduction, which is, this overview of the history of, ends up being the history of political cinema. And then we talk a little bit about third cinema, which is, I think, after Soviet cinema, or like maybe there with it, the most, I think the most known moment of intersection, right, between political activism and film, and also the discussions about film form, right? And of course, we go through, the usuals, like Battle of Algiers, and there are also the relations between more like mainstream infrastructures of film production with anti-colonial struggles, which can be seen in, for example, the relation between Pontecorvo and in doing Battle of Algiers, and also what in film history has been called third cinema, from Solanas and Getino's famous work towards third cinema, but also Spinoza's Imperfect Cinema, and of course Brazilian Glauber Rocha's Cinema Novo, text Aesthetics of Hunger. So this is like the canonical narrative of third cinema, and of course, Latin America, and then the African colonies and the decolonization moments, and then some of Asia too. But also it's important to remember some of the people that got erased, right, of the canonical narrative of third cinema, especially, for example, female directors. And I remembered, Sarah Maldoror in Mozambique, Ada Gomez in Cuba. Also the importance of also some of state apparatus, some state infrastructure of film production. Remembered ICAIC in Cuba. And also, in Brazil we have Solberg, Helena Solberg. So there are some names that got really erased from what we've received, as the usual narrative of third cinema. So this is also important to remember, and also expand the idea of third cinema, for example, towards black U.S. cinema. The people that were involved in the LA Rebellion, and then you also have black Brazilian cinema, that was happening kind of in like marginal circuits, peripheral circuits including of Cinema Novo. So people like Zosimo Bubu, Raquel Gerber, and then a lot of the young generations actually kind of also have this legacy of being invisible to also within the struggles of activist cinema. And then you can also think of like diasporic cinema, Asian American cinema, so you have all these ways of expanding the idea of third cinema. And then Luca.
Yeah, so if we look at the last 30 years or so, we sort of thought of two important things. The first one is what we could somehow generally call digital cinema. So it has become easier and easier to make film through digital media, and to upload cheaply on the internet has become somehow easier. But that doesn't mean that these films are necessarily accessible, or that there is a coherent narrative, a project, a collective project behind many of these films. So we looked at grassroots audiovisual production, often linked to political movements. Of course, again, at the end of the century and at the beginning of the new one, with movements such as those in Seattle, in Genoa, in Gothenburg, in Prague, and organizations that helped and fueled this kind of films, such as indie media. But we also thought it was important to underline how something like more traditional, like a realist narrative, still remain important. Authorist cinema in figures like Ken Loach or Sissako, or even that of Pedro Costa, Wang Bing, still remain important, especially in a sort of festival discourse around the world. So I would now, there's 3 people who are not with us. I'm going to say something about their papers in between the other presenters. So I'll now ask Cynthia Porter, who's based at Vanderbilt University, to tell us about her fantastic paper on Fury and Black Lives Matter movement.
Thank you very much for this invitation to present. And thank you everyone who's here. Everyone's having a wonderful day. And I just wanted to start to give you a bit of background. Again, my name is Cynthia Porter. I'm working on a PhD in German Studies and Comparative Media from Vanderbilt University, but I'm also currently teaching at Denison University in Ohio. My article really started off with a film called Fury by Fritz Lang. And it is his first American film, Hollywood debut, as it were, from 1936. But if any of you are familiar with Fritz Lang, and even those of you who may not be as familiar with his story, his background, or his work, he was originally from Austria. He immigrated to Germany, where he took on or adopted German citizenship before he emigrated by way of France to the United States. And along the way, of course, he cleared some hurdles for sure. He also already made a name for himself through his film like Metropolis, M, and Hangman Also Die, for example, before he landed in Hollywood, and his first film being one that continues to be salient today, Fury. And the background, or I'd say the context of the film, has a lot to do with race, and that's really what I honed in on. So I asked myself when rewatching the film 3 years ago, like, okay, so a film that was placed in 1936 that has to do with mob rule of a man, a white man, mind you, who was a victim of an attempted mob lynching. And in the course of watching the film, I see that there are some Black characters, Black minor characters, mind you, really reverberating some of the anxieties that are reflected in the plot of the film itself, even though the lynching or the attempted lynching that's taken place is comprised of white against white crime, instead of what we consider today as being more traditional mental images of lynching being Black or white on Black crime. And what makes this research or this work so valuable to me in this moment is how the same frustrations, the same arguments, the same anxieties continue to be reflected in the Black Lives Matter movement that we see continuing to be fought through in terms of civil rights and trying to get visibility again on some of the lived experiences of African Americans or Black Americans today. And with thematizing police brutality, mob rule, Black Lives Matter, when it comes to allocating time and space for narratives that communicate these anxieties, we can look back to our first representation of filmic evidence in a courtroom setting in Fury, and how we continue to see it practiced today as everybody has their cell phone on hand, everybody's recording instances of injustice and trying to use those same filmic forms of evidence to communicate these stories. And that's really what the whole article is comprised of, how we can look back at cinema to see some of the struggles that we continue to work through today, and how we hopefully can use these same media formats, like in the instance of an insurrection, for example, to continue to provide evidence of acknowledging who is culprit, acknowledging who is guilty, and using these same media formats to really bring justice to the forefront of our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this very clear introduction to your paper, and also for staying in the 5 minutes. Ekin Erkan could not be with us today, is the CUNY Graduate Center, and in his paper he discusses the political and philosophical ramification of the activities of Red Hack, a collective of radical activists based in Turkey. Daniel Fairfax is also one of the curator of the issues, our next speaker. He is based Goethe University in Frankfurt. He's well known for always speaking in time, so I really hope that he will be faithful to his fame.
Thank you, Luca. Yes, I'll try to keep it brief. So my paper looks at the French film journal Cahiers du Cinéma in a very particular moment of its history, which in some ways may be considered an aberrant moment in its history, but in other ways I think follows actually the logic of the journal quite interestingly, because partly Cahiers, founded in 1951, still around with us today, but in many ways, known for being, the journal that incubated Truffaut, Godard, Rivette, and so on and so forth. But I think throughout its history, it's kind of been an interesting barometer of the political atmosphere of the time. And this is most notably the case in the post-1968 period in France. Where, of course, you had the 68 uprising in May. You have the kind of mushrooming of a very radical left that kind of had as an article of faith that a revolutionary revolutionary insurrection was imminent. That May was just a dress rehearsal, and that the real deal was coming. Cahiers du Cinéma was not immune to this. Its editors were pretty young, mostly in their 20s and early 30s. They were living in Paris. They were around the kind of student left milieu, very kind of closely engaged with them. So they were very profoundly affected by that historical moment. And indeed, under the editorship of Jean-Louis Molly and Jean Narboni, took that journal in a very radical left-wing direction. A lot of people in film studies will be familiar with some of the texts that were produced in that period, notably with titles like Technique and Ideology, Cinema, Ideology, Criticism, the analysis of Young Mr. Lincoln that they did, which also focuses on the trope of I guess, mob violence in 1930s American cinema. Interesting parallels with Fury. But the focus of my article is actually a period slightly after that kind of halcyon moment for Cahiers du Cinéma, when kind of having gone in the direction of let's say, Marxism initially, they kind of went even further towards this kind of what in the end would be a very explicit Maoist doctrine for the journal. So particular kind of from late 1971 up until about mid 1973, there was a very conscious adherence to Maoism, to Marxist Leninism, which kind of sounds strange to us today, but in the context of France at that time, actually, Maoism was a thriving political movement. It was a very attractive pole that served as an alternative to particularly to the French Communist Party for a lot of French youth and a lot of kind of radicalizing French kind of students and intellectuals. So I guess in the midst of this kind of turn towards Maoism, the Cahiers editors, but this time kind of a broader collective of around 10 or so critics, hatched a plan for what they called the Revolutionary Cultural Front, or Front Culturel Révolutionnaire, which they kind of conceived of as bringing together basically all the far left cultural activists in France from different kind of artistic or cultural spheres, but basically kind of trying to bring everyone operating in all different parts of the country and different arts and cultural movements together in some kind of a coherent organizational structure. They planned for the launch of this or kind of front to take place during the Avignon Cultural Festival in August 1973, and spent about a year from mid-72 up until August 73, really dedicating themselves to the preparation of this conference. At the same time, they were also developing kind of, I guess, their own form of a Marxist aesthetics of cinema, which I think started out very interestingly in trying to kind of, I guess, articulate a revolutionary form and content, but very soon kind of got co-opted into a kind of much more dogmatic approach to aesthetic theory and film criticism. And in the end, I think departed actually from a lot of Cahiers de Cinema's earlier principles from the kind of late 1960s and early 1970s. Unfortunately, the Revolutionary Cultural Front was, or the launch of it was perceived as a debacle. Around 150 people turned up, which was not a bad turnout. But what really kind of disillusioned the Cahiers de Cinema critics was let's say, the quality of discussion during this event over the course of, I think, around 6 days, where the conference kind of descended into this kind of internecine sectarian bickering. And indeed, Cahiers de Cinema's own kind of political credentials were routinely called into question during the event. So in the aftermath of it, they kind of, I guess, I think basically were traumatized by their perceived failure. And indeed, this was at a moment where the French left in general, and the French Maoist left in particular, really were kind of almost disintegrating in front of their eyes. And you kind of, I think 1973 really is the start of a kind of conservative wave in France that would end up having kind of long-term repercussions. So it was bad timing, kind of misstate with history in a sense. But I think it was an interesting experience for them to go through, an interesting experience to kind of look back on from a historical perspective. And not just as a failure, not just to kind of criticize or as a negative example, but I think in a few key ways it kind of challenges, I think, us today in the present context. And I think there are probably I wasn't so explicit about this in my article, but I think thinking about it for tonight, I'd say there are 3 key lessons that the whole experience can give to us, which in fact in some ways tie in with what Luca and Keiji were saying in the introduction. First of all, like the Soviets, there's a real emphasis on the kind of necessary combination and interaction of theory and practice. So not to consider film theory as existing in one silo and then filmmaking in another silo, but to try to bring them together to kind of theorize practice and practice theory and so on and so forth. Praxis, as Marxist terminology would have it. Secondly, the idea of a kind of collectivist form of cultural struggle, which I think is indeed, as Luca kind of noted this, but I would agree, this is kind of a bit absent today. There's kind of there's no lack of people trying to kind of articulate politics and art, but there's a lack of a kind of broader kind of collective notion of that those individual activities would be a part of. And so this is an attempt in 1973 to rectify that. I think we need to think about what we can do today in the same vein. And finally, in line with this, the need for some kind of a democratic organizational structure in which those kind of collectivist actions can take place, or there can be a framework for those to take place in. So that was basically, those are the lessons I drew from that experience. But I'd be interested to hear more from fellow panelists and attendees.
Thank you, Danny. This was very interesting, and I really like also how sometimes we write a paper and then a few months after we think
realize
about
what it was all about.
There's more to say, can write a second version. So now I would ask Renzo Sgolacchia to speak. He's based at UAV in Venice, but also, if I understood well, as an affiliation at Delft in the Netherlands. And he's going to be talking to us about Rotterdam, the squatting movements, and how cinema relates to that.
Hi, yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation and to the discussion, and also thanks to the reviewers and to the editors, because yeah, you were fundamental to let's say, to stimulate me to provide a better, a good article in the end. So I decided to write this article because basically squatting in the Netherlands and especially in Rotterdam still exists because it is co-opted in the capitalistic mechanism somehow. Since 2010, when was already banned with a national law, the term squatting became really ambiguous. So it was used by many institutions somehow to promote cultural activities and whatever, and also local governments started to support the occupied buildings, or the squatting activity that was basically just and solely providing cultural activities rather than social activities, and somehow, yeah, this one was one of the main motivation, and so the films were somehow a good source to discuss about what was the main meaning of squatting in Rotterdam, especially because this part of the Rotterdam movement was not really well described historically, and because also really fragmented. So I tried to not focus on the obvious characteristic of squatting, and I tried to focus on the let's say on the city of Rotterdam as the productive city, and squatting as and I try to analyze squatting for its capacity to its capability to interfere within the productive city, and somehow one of the peculiarity of these films is that the filmmakers and the squatters the filmmakers are the squatters as themselves, and they are basically kind of amateur film, but it became a proper film genre that was, and these films were screened constantly in occupied buildings, and somehow they also stimulate the social conflict itself. So in the end, they are all short films, and I just decided for the article to analyze deeply two of these films, and because one of them is more related with the golden age of squatting in the city, when, as was defined by a squatter, the city was somehow the paradise of squatting. There were many vacant buildings, And another film is more about the decline period. What is pretty fundamental to consider is that the first film, it tells more about an alternative way to conceive an urban planning. So from the squatting point of view, just occupying buildings, let's say, rather than impose a master plan. And so try to reuse what already the city can offer. And the other one, the second one, it basically tells the story of a kind of imaginary building that we can find in the city, just walking through a kind of calculated path by the filmmaker, of course. An imaginary building that is in the city that consists of many squatted buildings. And yeah, those are the two examples. I hope it's clear. Thanks.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Alessia Lombardini also could not be with us. She's an independent researcher based in Rome. Her essay focuses on the role played by newsreel films in Italian politics in 1960s, with a particular attention to the newsreels that were promoted by Cesare Zavattini. We stay in the realm of Italian cinema with our next presenters. They wrote the paper together, Dom Holdaway and Dalila Missero, who are based respectively in Urbino in Italy and at Oxford Brookes. I'm not sure who's going to speak first.
I will, if that's okay. We figured we'd go that way. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having us here and for all the work on the issue. We were really grateful for it and grateful for the chance to contribute our paper, which is about Italian cinema, about specifically political Italian cinema from the last couple of decades, more or less. And actually the article was kind of born out of some frustrations that Dalila and I both shared in relation to certainly the representational agendas of certain kinds of forms of contemporary political cinema, but also maybe as a result of that, some of the discourses surrounding political cinema as well, and what that might or might not include or exclude, especially from the perspective of identity. So we kind of wanted to look at partly who makes Italian political cinema in the present, or again, I should say a specific kind of Italian political cinema, but more specifically who's represented in these kinds of films, and maybe try and, I don't know, we kind of had two objectives that were born of this process. The first of which was perhaps more obviously criticizing or opening up a space for a criticism of that kind of cinema, in terms of, to borrow the kind of terminology that the editors were using and have used, and Keiji was mentioning earlier in your introduction, in terms of invisibility in particular, because the long story short is this kind of political cinema tends to be quite normative in its focus, and focus particularly on social conflicts of different natures, but drawing particularly on personal experiences of men, particularly white, heterosexual, bourgeois men, or at least that seems to be the focus, if not in the film, at least in the kind of in the discourses around the films. So the first objective, which I'll just say a couple of words more about very briefly now, was trying to open a space to criticize that kind of representation agenda. And then the second objective, actually, which is really the second half of the essay that Dalila will say a couple of words about in just a second, was kind of trying to enact a really deliberate shift of focus away from that kind of subject, and see if we can create a kind of more productive, maybe intersectional space to talk about political cinema. So on the first objective, on the side of criticism, of course, as probably is relatively common knowledge, Italian film history is very rich in its political representations, in particular in representing the different kinds of affairs of Italian history, of the mafia, of different kinds of social movements, of corruption, and especially of terrorism. And that kind of specific interest in Italian political cinema has, of course, moved into the present too. And it was on those kinds of representations, also particularly of social conflicts, in line with the focus of the special issue that we wanted to draw attention to, And I should say that in our criticism of these kinds of representations, like I said before, we are speaking of a very specific kind of Italian political cinema. So what we might call mainstream political cinema, certainly not as mainstream as like a popular comedy might be, but certainly mainstream in terms of certainly presence in the theatre, tickets sold, but also mainstream in sense of centrality and the discourses that these kinds of films inspired. And we can quite easily looking at these kinds of films in representations of social movements, and the examples that we used in the first half of the essay are 3 films from the 2000s, well, one from 2000 called The 100 Steps, which is about the mafia killing a journalist who tries to stand up to the mafia. The film Il Grande Sogno, The Big Dream from 2009, which is about the 1968 riots in Rome. And a film that has the slightly trash title in English, Piazza Fontana, The Italian Conspiracy, or Romanzo di una strage, from 2012, which talks about terrorism and the explosion in Piazza Fontana in 1969. And looking at these examples of films and the kinds of representations of social movements within these films, on the one hand, you can say, first, there is a really, really significant invisibility, which is that of social movements that have to do with minorities. So we can't really see any kinds of representations of feminism or queer movements, which is what we focus on in the article, but there's no reason to limit ourselves just to those ones in general, but also in terms of representation more specifically. The female characters in these films tend to be put into roles where they only have to do emotional labor, if at all, unlike all of the male characters. And queer characters tend basically not to exist in the films, or if they do, they tend to be either maybe sexual predators or very, very, very implicit. And actually the last thing I would say is that in the case of I 100 Passi, the 100 Steps, which is a really interesting case, we've found out that the film, when it was being made in the late 1990s, it was actually in competition with another equivalent version of the same true story of this guy, Peppino Impastato, who was killed by the mafia, in which, in a historically accurate way, in the unmade version of the film, there was a much more open representation of Peppino Impastato and his homosexuality. So it kind of leads us to the conclusion that in these representations, there needs to be some kind of normative representation of particularly male characters and straight male characters. And so, like I said, we wanted to kind of find a space where it was possible to criticize that. And like I said before, maybe even move on from just talking about those kinds of films. And that's a good moment maybe to pass over to Dalila.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, in the part of the essay I'm going to expose now, we basically try to shift our attention to those movies in which our representation of women and queer political engagement is present. So we focused on documentaries about feminism, and especially second wave feminism directed by women. And also we focused on films in which there's certain form of representation of queer characters that is more explicit and is not, and it's unveiled somehow. So we just try to put together a very heterogeneous set of representations, and I particularly concentrated on the documentaries about feminism, which have been released in the last 20 years in Italy. Not many, but quite a bit of movies in which there's an explicit representation and reconstruction of second wave feminism, and a certain representation that we found it was quite nostalgic and attempted to represent this past of the second wave movement as a set of big achievements and like something that has been somehow a past that is resolved, in which as for new generations, we have like to feel kind of, looking at those representations and feel ourselves in those same very struggles. Whereas we are aware that now in Italy, there are different kinds of like intersectional sort of social movements emerging, and different questions in feminism that didn't find any space in this kind of representations, in which there's this sort of nostalgia and retrospective look to what have been the feminist struggles in Italy, and not just in Italy, but there's also this very strict focus on what is like the nation as well. So it's a very constrained representation in confront of what is like the social movement in Italy is now, in terms of also transnationalism and also intersectionality, this very close dialogue also with queer movements and trans feminism as well, that is completely absent as well from the mainstream discourses about feminism, representation, and gender too. So we also touched a little bit upon the reception of the Me Too movement in Italy as well. And we thought that these things are all interconnected in a way, this fixation on the past, this lack of representation in the mainstream, and at the same time, this kind of invisibility of what are the new generational struggles and questions that have been posed most recently in Italy by the feminist movement. And so what we decided to do at that point was like questioning this kind of representations of the past and the social movement. And by taking a perspective that was our perspective as feminist and queer spectator, taking somehow back the tradition of feminist and queer scholarship of like trying to look against the grain of these representations, but also at the same time to go beyond this, individual position in which you just like try to grasp with mainstream representation and try to find something that can be redemptive for you as a woman, as a feminist, or as a queer politicized spectator. So we tried, to take this positioning, the different positioning in confront of these movies, and also try to go beyond the against the grain perspective. So this is what we sought to do with the essay, and this is pretty much it. So I will leave the space to the next speaker at this point.
Thank you, and I really hope being part of that community that scholars of Italian cinema will tackle these issues in the coming years, and it seems that it could happen. So I think it's a very good essay for that. Daniel Lawrence Hoffman, who's also now with us, wrote a paper on the relationship between popular cinema and the suffragist movement in the United States in the 1910s, very interesting one. And our last speaker is Fabio Andrade, who's a film critic and scholar who is currently at NYU, and he will tell us about new Brazilian cinema in the period between 2016 and 2018, if I remember correctly.
Thank you, Luca. Thanks, everybody from Zapruder World. I'll be another person to complement the great work in editing the journal and the great work that the readers have done as well. And I really appreciate how transnational and intersectional the issue is. And it's a pleasure to be here talking to all of you today. My essay focuses on 3 films that were all not shot, but released the same year in 2017. And had, pretty successful runs in the international film festival circuit, the films. And it's great because I'm actually talking about films that you can all watch right now because they're all available worldwide, which is not common for Brazilian cinema. So the films are Araby by Afonso Shoa and João Dumans, which is being distributed by Grasshopper Film in the US and available for VOD in many different places in the world. Good Manners by Marco Dutra and Juliana Rojas, distributed by Distrib Films. And Once There Was Brasilia by Adirley Queiroz, which is currently streaming in the Criterion channel. So if anybody wants to check them out, I highly recommend them. And my article is especially interested in how these 3 films that are being released in 2017 are interacting with the historical moment of Brazil having what I consider, and many of us consider, an illegitimate government and an illegitimate president, which is Michel Temer, the president that got to power after pretty much planning a coup against his former partner in the presidency, President Dilma Rousseff, who's ousted in 2016. I think that is specifically interesting for Brazilian cinema because these 3 films, as much of Brazilian cinema, were all funded with government funds. So I'm interested in how that interaction happens, you know, the sort of official nature of government-funded Brazilian cinema with the political moment and how they address the political moment in both their text and their form as well. And these three specific films are, I think, using sort of borrowing and appropriating conventions from, on the one hand, the art house world, and I use an article, that classical article by David Bordwell about what he calls the art cinema, which is a term that I particularly don't like, but that I use for clarity reasons, and also genre in a way to communicate politics and to express this sort of provisional moment that these films are made in and that these films are released in, because the Temer presidency lasts, you know, a little around 2 years between the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff and the legitimate election, until proven contrary, of the fascist president that we have in government now, Jair Bolsonaro. So I'm interested in how these films are borrowing some of these conventions, right? Where I'm talking about here, Araby is a working class travelogue, Good Manners is a queer werewolf film, and Once There Was Brasilia is an Afrofuturist sci-fi, and they're all borrowing from these traditions, a tradition that Bordeaux specifically sees as fairly apolitical, and these films are actually repoliticizing it from within, using form to actually inject it with politics and express something about that specific social political moment here in Brazil. I think that's all I wanted to introduce.
Thank you very much, Fabio. Re-listening to you sort of talk about the papers and looking at those who couldn't be with us today, I really sort of rethought about how heterogeneous this issue is, and the sort of multiple possible facets of political cinema and of the relationship more broadly between cinema and social conflict. So I have some comments, but first I want to open up to questions. If you have questions for each other or any general comments, we do have some time, like half an hour or so, something like that for discussion. So I'll leave it to you first. Yeah, Dalila?
Yeah, I have a question for Cynthia, and I haven't had the opportunity yet to read your article, but really looking forward to it. And I was just like, maybe it's just a curiosity, as like a methodological question, like how did you deal with anachronism in your piece? Because of course you are talking about two very different historical moments, and like I'm very curious to see that, because it's something that sometimes I struggle too. So yeah, it's really fascinating, and I would like to know more how you did it.
Sure. So that was definitely one of the main struggles of how to create a structure that didn't feel very disjointed. So my intention, between sort of oscillating between the mid 1930s and the present day, was to also kind of include kind of like a snapshot of many different phenomena. So looking at mob rule and how its history has been very, I'd say, just particular in an American context. And so in providing that framework, it kind of assisted in bridging the gap. And also in the meantime, in the literature review, or the people that I kind of use in order to provide theory, kind of also helped bridge the gap in order to illustrate that there's a lot of repetition in a lot of these issues. And unfortunately, America is not, we tend to continue to struggle with accountability. Like, it doesn't seem to be a strong suit. So when it comes to questions of equal rights or the justice system, a lot of these questions are very personal for a lot of Americans, particularly people of color. And for me, it was also, you know, it's something that in the past 7 years is just kind of, it's always been in the forefront, but it keeps on spiking general public interest. And so I was very curious to see how different eras, I suppose, encountered the same types of spikes. And it's just that, you know, today, now that we have digital media so prominent in our daily lives, the 24/7 news cycle, just all these things, really showing or trying to show how, I suppose, let's see, it's not as unique to this moment as we like to think it is. And that was really my intention in really bridging these two, like you were saying, they're very different time frames, right? So 1936 compared to now 2021. Also, you know, serving to show that there is a lot of continuity in our society. And unfortunately, a lot of the issues that we are continuing to face call for a lot of accountability. And we continue to see the struggle of holding ourselves accountable for, let's see, how do I phrase this? Just moments of questionable intentions. Try to view that as neutral as possible. But we see that it's continuing to be a problem today. Thank you for that question.
Sorry, can I jump in, Luca? Okay, well, thanks everybody for the very good presentations. Yeah, I agree with Luca. It's a very heterogeneous issue. And also it's interesting to see, I was thinking, it's interesting to see how all of your papers actually put some pressure on the very definition of political cinema and also of the relation between the political, right, and cinema. I think it's very like refreshing, and you don't need to like necessarily deal with contemporary materials in order to find different ways of understanding the political, right, in the aesthetic or in the cinematic. I had a question to Cynthia also. I mean, I have a lot of questions, but like since Cynthia is already on the spot, I decided to like bring my question to her. So your piece is really interesting. Also, the way that it shows the like I'll say like the shift in the evidentiary power of the moving image, right? I think that was very central, and it's interesting that it is already there in Fury, and you see how this actually it becomes a certain, you know, it becomes like central part of film theory when it relates to, in general, but also when it relates to documentary, right? The need for suspicion when you deal with the moving image. And I just wanted to ask you, one, if you think so because you point Lang's film as like the beginning of this particular experience of watching documentary footage within the film and like debating this use, like legal use of a moving image in the context of a whitewashed lynching, right? So I wonder if you see, I mean, this is really extrapolating the scope of your article, but I just wanted just to think if just to ask you if you see any relation between the types of crimes and the different legal status of the moving image, right? So if they were like being crimes of hate crimes, right, committed by white people upon Black people, does this really make the status of the legal status of moving image weaker in terms of the use in the legal system, the judiciary system? And another thing is like, do you see a different like I don't know, a change in the use and the power, the legal power of moving image with the current use of digital media, handheld cameras? Do you think it gained power or it lost power? It lost power in order to create actual legal changes? Because, you know, when you see like actually the evidentiary power of film cameras is really high, it's really big, I think. Like you see these images circulating and they become proofs of evidence, right? Even before trial, even before. But I wonder if you see any relation between the the widespread of these images and their actual, the intensification of suspicion on these images within the legal system. I don't know if I made myself clear, but I was just trying to see if there is like a change with technology and also with discourse in relation to the power of the moving image.
I would definitely say, and I believe that I am understanding you correctly, and feel free to chime in if I'm deviating from your intention a little bit too much. But when it comes to questions of reliability and really investing, I'm just going to call it the moving image in order to make it a little bit more broad, investing the moving image with, I guess, the capacity to reflect and replay sequential moments as packaged as truth. And that's where things get kind of wonky, right? So we are the closest, we believe, in some cases, we're the closest as we can be to replaying sequential moments in time through the medium of the moving image. But at the same time, we also know that the moving image is very easy to manipulate, right? And we know that particularly now in this moment, the accessibility of like editing and modifying, whether it's still images or moving images, is more broadly accessible. So a lot of the questions about reliability and truth, fundamentally speaking, are questioned in the first place, I would say nowadays, just really posing, regardless of what you see, particularly if it's a video or a moving image file, asking, can I trust this? Where is this coming from? Is that a reliable source, particularly in the era of fake news, right? So just really asking or posing the question as a civilian, right? So like it is regardless of what format we experience this through, whether it's social media like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, or if it's from considered to be reputable news outlets, you know, like our heavy hitters, whether it's Fox News, CNN, ABC, NBC, right? So the questions of, can we accept what we see as truth, is undermined by the question of what is truth. And that is problematized every time film, particularly, or moving image, is presented to show that an event happened. Like even that fundamental consideration, like this happened, is what is being brought into question. And I would say that to return to your comment about like hate crimes and what kind of crimes kind of get awarded a little bit more truth, or perhaps truth a little bit more willingly than others, that in and of itself can be tricky, right? So I mentioned this in my article as well, in response to the need, at the very least, the desire to present truth of what's happening in the moment. Now that we know that filmic evidence or video recorded evidence is received often with skepticism, that's when people started shifting to live streaming. And that was first done through Facebook. Hey, Facebook. And in response to that, there have been some apps that have been developed and released, like Witness is one, Copwatch is another, that really, I suppose it's the intention to reinstill faith and reinstill legitimacy in the presentation of a moving image. And that is a tension that I think we're continuing to see as a society, the American system grappling with, where we see videos taken seriously in some contexts and less seriously or shrouded with doubt or skepticism if presented by others. And it's very challenging since there is no blanket law that says that recording the police is legal or illegal. And it's very difficult to track where some of these images or videos are coming from. So all of these things really contribute to the conversation, but this of whether or not something is reliable right? But the struggle in that is that we do not, as far as I know in this moment, we do not have an alternative option that could do the same type of work. So there's the potential, right, for truth that's embedded in the moving image. But at the same time, that potential for truth is tainted by simply the medium and how easy it is to modify.
Thank you. I like how liveness becomes we go back to liveness as a solution, Danny.
Yeah, I just have a question. I think Cynthia, what you're saying raises a whole lot of questions in my mind, but I have a question for someone else right now. For Fabio in particular, I really loved your article and your presentation. And I guess my question is kind of like, what happens now in Brazil, or what is happening, or what will happen? Because you end kind of your article by saying, I mean, you have this whole kind of, the Temer administration is this kind of provisional state as a caretaker kind of president. Now we have the election of Bolsonaro, which was kind of, I guess, the logical outcome of the impeachment of Dilma. And as you put it, like the kind of just the entire kind of cinema industry is just kind of being shut down virtually. And Bolsonaro kind of considers the whole film world to be his political enemies. And it's just like, I mean, the films you focus on were films that kind of carried over into the Temer regime, but the kind of wheels of the film industry were still running. So what are filmmakers doing now if they're like not getting money they're not getting funding, there's no infrastructure? I mean, how do they respond?
Thanks for that question, Danny. I think it's really an important aspect of the whole thing, because the generation of filmmakers that made these 3 films, they all kind of blossom in the context of public policies by the workers' parties to democratize access to funding, democratize access to universities. So that really changed the landscape of Brazilian cinema, connecting to what Dalila and Dom were saying about the official political cinema in Italy, that we kind of experienced that shift because of actual public policies in Brazil for the past 2 decades. And I talk about open-ended films, and I had to make the article open-ended as well, because we are still kind of waiting to see where things are going to go. Right now, the Cinemateca Brasileira, which is the largest film archive in Brazil, has been closed for a year without any employees working there. So the damage is already done to a large portion of Brazilian cinema that's stored there. And it's the largest archive in Latin America. So you have a sense of how big the damage is. And pretty much every funding opportunity has either been revoked or frozen since the beginning of the Bolsonaro presidency. So we're not yet, as you mentioned, experiencing a sort of drought in films, because films take a long time to get made. But I know that film festivals are already noticing a reduction of the number of feature films that are being submitted every year, because I think in 3 years from now we're really gonna have some kind of blackout, not total, because digital technology has made it possible for people to make films in other ways. But definitely the possibility of making a living as a filmmaker is now jeopardized in Brazil. And we know that if we're thinking about filmmakers who are working in peripheral areas of the country, filmmaking has to be a way to make a living so that they can make films. Otherwise, if it's not a feasible way to make a living, they cannot devote themselves to that, right? We couldn't do it either. So I do think that there is going to be a huge effect within the next few years. And the discussions are, to me, also worrisome right now in Brazil, because without the presence of public funding, which has generated all these great films that are very creative because they have so much artistic freedom in the system that was in place in Brazil, filmmakers are now turning to television, Netflix, and all the other multinational corporations that can still provide some kind of money for them to keep making work and get by. But I do think that will lead to a dramatically different cinema when those films are ready.
Can I just add also some additional comments on this, So I think like what Fabio was saying, the Lula and Dilma era were crucial for many reasons, right? For the structure of film education, film festivals, and points like places of production, funding. So it's like a lot of like a really wide array of different structural and material measures that were in place in order to produce people engaged in film. So I think although it's a horrible moment that we're living, I think there is a whole new generation of filmmakers that entered, you know, and like kind of gained the possibility of making films and of thinking film and theorizing, you know, and actually, you know, producing the scores also, not only film. So I think we're definitely gonna face a kind of like really bad moments, bad years ahead. But I think it's like, instead of being, no, I'm not trying to be optimistic. I'm just trying to I'm just trying to think. You know, I do firmly believe that there was a shift, a paradigm shift within Brazilian cinema, right? Also in discourse and also on historical perspective of Brazilian cinema. That I think this is gonna be sustained through the years. I think, and I mean the alternative, you know, Netflix, all these alternative means of film funding, film production, they will have some importance, I guess. And also some new alliances were formed, you know, among specific groups of filmmaking, like young black filmmakers, you know, and filmmakers from the periphery. But yeah, I don't know. I think we're gonna have a problem with the big hegemonic Brazilian cinema, you know, but I think there's gonna be other things happening. I don't know, just trying to be not.
I think more in general, I mean, the Brazilian case is a very specific one, but I think the more in general, what's gonna happen to state money, to, you know, public funding for films in many countries is really an issue at stake today, not just because of censorship and so because of political will of not making films, but because of coronavirus. I mean, quite objectively, many countries will have issues in the next couple of years, 3 or 4 years, to finance films. And it seems that Netflix is already, and Amazon Prime and all the different platforms are already chipping in quite heavily. I mean, here in Italy, for example, the only films that were sort of made to a public discourse in the last couple of months were Netflix, films or TV shows on Netflix. So that's this sort of dynamic between new large production companies, because at this point, this is what they are, and films that, in a sense, also become what Dalila and Dom were saying, kind of official national films. I think this is already happening, and it will be quite important and interesting to see in the next few years, not just in Brazil, what's going to happen. I have a couple of, they're not really questions, they're more comments. One thing that sort of really listening to your papers, I was thinking is that the issue of invisibility is one of the issues that sort of run across our issues in different ways in Dom and Dalila's paper, but also in many others. And I think there's always something to say about political cinema and conflict and invisibility, that it's there somehow. And the other thing I was thinking, mostly listening to Renzo's paper, is how in cinema too, we see what happens to many revolutionary movements or sort of protests in general that are sort of co-opted by capital and become less politically strong or apolitical. And I think that that's something that we see in cinema or in filmic movements as well. And that's something too that's been kind of in the back of my mind recently. And I rethought about this listening to your paper. So it was just a couple of comments. Other questions, proper questions?
I was actually thinking the same thing, Luca, when I was listening to Renzo, but also when Daniel was presenting his paper about this idea of cooptation, which is something that I think we all probably bump against at some point. And what is the role of purity in both, I think, political movements, but also when at the intersection of political movements and art? You know, what is the role that we assign to purity? I'm just curious to hear from other folks, because it's something that's always in my mind as well.
That's a big question for the left, right?
I'm not really sure how to, I think I'm struggling with the same problems that I kind of present in my article of really having a hard time as a consumer, right? Being able to be like, oh, well, this is pure like exposure to what happened. And that is, since it's so difficult to know that, unless it is like live stream, like we were mentioning earlier, it is so challenging in order to, I suppose, identify, like if somebody were to leave footprints of there being something edited or a video getting edited, we know like some of the tells are there being cuts, right? If there's a cut, we know that something happened in terms of bringing or bridging together different video feeds or moving image feeds. Another question would be like perspective, right? That comes up in the film in Fury, where we don't know who authored this video or media, as it were, and that in and of itself. So like authorship, and I think that's an interesting turnaround, and how that impacts our perspective of whether or not this is pure, whether this is reliable, whether this is trustworthy, as it were. And so I think that that is a great observation of a struggle point when dealing with cinema. Like, what would pure cinema or moving image look like? How would we be able to recognize it? Would we be able to recognize it when we see it, right? Depending on how it's done, I want to say yes, but again, I'm skeptical. So it's the same issue. So I'm curious to hear what the co-contributors feel on the subject.
Can I?
Mm-hmm.
Or
then,
Daniel? I don't know. It's the
Dalila and then Daniel.
Yeah, I think that the question of purity is a very central one, especially when we're dealing with cinemas. Is like, you know, it's basically mass culture. At least what we were, the movies we were analyzing, you know, where we wanted to focus on mainstream movies, you know, not grassroots filmmaking, because it was more challenging for us trying to stay in that position and not like, you know, and also kind of, you know, coming to terms with this idea of purity that we have about, you know, what feminism would be, what would be the perfect or the right representation of a queer character. There's this idea of utopia as well, you know, that is very embedded in social movements and also in activism. And we really reflected on Richard Dyer's work and his idea of entertainment and utopia as well, you know, this need that we have to engage with politics on emotional terms, you know, and like, I think that that's what mass culture can do in a way, you know, trying to, you know, grasp this idea of, you know, politics as feelings as well, that they are necessarily impure in a way, you know, there's this impurity that goes on, you know, and so we really struggle to confront with this mainstream, so to speak, because of course they are niche national cinema in a way, but at the same time, it's really something that we have to confront with, especially now that I see, for instance, in this question of representation in popular culture, mainstream popular culture as well. If you think about a lot of Netflix series as well, in which you see a lot of more diversity going on right now. And I see sometimes that the scripts or the ways, the characters, there's not tokenism, but sometimes feels like it. So you feel like, what's going on? How politics and how certain political agendas are embedded in popular culture, and what feels authentic and what it doesn't. So it's like really always struggling. But I think that what Richard Dyer says about feeling and emotion and politics, entertainment and utopia, it's very, very helpful to try to have a relationship with certain representations that is, you know, more productive also when you think about cinema as a political art form in a way.
Danny?
Yeah, thank you, Fabio, for the question. I mean, I think it's almost like the picture that's being painted of the contemporary reality that we're facing is one in which this kind of public funding model, which has been the dominant means for which kind of filmmaking has been cultivated in the last 50 years. Filmmaking that is in some ways kind of, let's say, more adventurous than a strictly commercial cinema. This is evaporating, and instead it's being replaced with this the vampire squid of Netflix and Amazon Prime, which, you know, gives us the crumbs of kind of certain gestures to identity politics, which I think, you know, I'd go further than Dalila and say it is tokenism. I mean, it is. I mean, it might be felt genuinely, but the political effect is tokenistic. But at the expense of what I find to be a kind of crushing aesthetic homogenization, a kind of programming by algorithm, you know, programming of the content as well as programming of the spectator. Right, we get programs through the Netflix algorithm to watch what, you know, the company decides is good for us. And yeah, and by the same token, a kind of surveillance model of actually drawing or extracting profit out of providing content to the viewer, which I think has politically hugely costly effects for the world. And then the only alternative to that being, or well, I think maybe the alternative that this kind of calls for is perhaps some kind of dare I say it, like a kind of new underground? I don't know, like something that, because this is like, what alternative do we have but to just kind of go almost exhume the kind of 60s underground model, because it's of like, you know, Super 8 or experimental cinema in kind of like marginal spaces and so on and so forth, but obviously in a digital environment. For want of any kind of any alternative in that sense. In that sense, yeah, I mean, maybe that is the space for a kind of more purist aesthetics and a more purist politics of cinema. But I think the obstacles are very significant.
I think this is an excellent conclusion, unless anyone else has comments or
It's
questions.
a very pessimistic one, though, Luca. I'm sorry.
This is
We're not exactly living happy times, so
very
that's
suitable for our times. Yeah.
Well, you're not an optimistic man in general, so I think that works well.
Well, to be a little less pessimistic, I think maybe those spaces are already being formed, you know, like those spaces of alternative filmic production and exhibition and interaction. At least I can think of, you know, some examples of this type of movement at least trying to emerge. So,
and the only other thing I would add would be, I mean, I feel like every event should end with quoting Gramsci to the effect of pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. So if we can think of that in the face of everything that's going on out in the outside world right now.
Thank you very much. So I want to thank you once again for participating in this roundtable, and please keep sharing the articles. And I'm really happy that we did this and to have co-edited this issue of Zapruder World. Brian, any final thought, or we should just say bye?
No, just thank you to all the authors and the editors. This, I think, and I've said this privately to each of you, that I think this is the journal's best volume yet. So congratulations on a really successful volume.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks to you guys. Thanks to the editors.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks.